Earlier this week, I sat down with Rhode Island Secretary of State Gregg Amore to talk about same-day voter registration, how they purge the voter rolls, and more. Here's that interview in full. There have been a lot of bills on voting and elections filed, and you have a handful that you've had filed on your behalf. So let's start with same-day registration.
Sure. So same-day registration was part of the bigger Let Rhode Island Vote package, but not passed in the last legislative session. And the interesting part about same-day voter registration in Rhode Island is it requires a constitutional change, right? So it's embedded in the Rhode Island Constitution that the 30-day is the limit. So we would have to have a referendum question go to the people of Rhode Island, who would then determine whether or not that would be removed and same-day voter registration would be an option. And at that point, the General Assembly would determine what that actually looks like.
And that would have to be in a general election, though, so that would be for 24.
Correct. I mean, I guess, in essence, the General Assembly could decide whatever election they wanted it to take place in, but yes.
And is your thinking to mirror what the federal do, that you can do that for presidential, but not really for anything else?
Yeah, so we already do it for president and vice president, and I think last election, close to 6,000 folks registered the day of the election and voted. So it's not a different process that we're already doing, it's just for the entire ballot. And 22 states already do it, plus the District of Columbia. The establishment of the 30-day window, and in some states it's 20, Massachusetts is 10, that establishment was really based on bureaucracy, the ability of paper to move from one place to another. Now with the central voter registration system, that barrier no longer exists. There's really no reason we can't register folks the day of the election. And it's important to understand that that wouldn't take place at a polling place. That would take place at the city or town hall or a singular designated place where people would register and vote at that same place. So poll workers who only work every 2 years would not be burdened with a same-day registration and vote. That would happen at the location, normally a city or town hall.
So you'd have to take the 2 steps, and it's not like a provisional ballot.
Correct.
It would be ready to go. Now, because of technology the way it is now, they would communicate immediately with the poll worker that this person's good to go?
Correct. Well, they would vote directly at the same location. So they would register and vote there with the person who registered them.
So you're bypassing your normal precinct altogether.
Correct.
The pushback on that, a lot of people say, well, if voting is as important as it is to you, why can't you register before that? What do you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the best example is the person who has come to this country legally, has gone through the naturalization process, becomes a citizen, takes the oath to the country at the federal court, and that happens on October 25th. And they're not allowed to vote. They've been living here for 5 years. The most American thing to do is to be able to vote. I think that's the best example, but there are many examples. I mean, you could be a decorated military veteran and move from Massachusetts to Rhode Island, have a very good grasp on what's going on in the region, be an incredibly informed voter, and because maybe the closing on your home happened at a certain time, and whenever you're moving, things get lost. The idea that someone's not allowed to vote based on an arbitrary number that was decided really based on bureaucratic need and administrative need, not on a democratic principle. And that's really it. If you live in a district for 1 day or 1 year, the person you're voting for is still going to be your representative or mayor or et cetera.
You want to move the primary up?
We do. We have a problem with the primary, and that is we're the last primary or the second to last primary every year. And because we're so close to the general, we bump into the Federal MOVE Act, which requires us to send overseas military ballots to folks 45 days ahead of the general election.
How long has that MOVE back been in effect?
1993.
Because I haven't heard anything until now.
Well, we've just been skating on thin ice until now.
And just getting by every year?
I think what has really drawn my attention is that elections are being contested now. And if elections are litigated or there are multiple recounts, now you're going to push that result, the certification, off to the point where we're not going to be able to get those ballots out. And if we disenfranchise one of our overseas military personnel, that's just not acceptable. Now there's another factor too, and that's it puts a lot of pressure on elections administrators, especially the folks in our office who are preparing ballots, to do so correctly in a short amount of time. And if we had that extra, in our case, the bill is to move the primary to the last Tuesday in August. That would give us an extra 14 days to deal with any litigation, deal with any recounts, but also give us a good amount of time to prepare the next ballot for the general election. And it's only a matter of time before Rhode Island has a litigated election, an election that's so close that it moves us past the point of no return in regard to certification.
A lot of people would say you're in the dead of August. A lot of people are away, but voting has changed. You have a 20-day early voting and other mechanisms to be able to do that. Is that your answer to what, you're all about bringing in as many people as you can. The person's in California, the person's in Scarborough. Oh, I forgot, it's VJ Day or whatever. So how do you address that in terms of August? Your first preference though was May or June.
June, right. So I think
the people down the hall would have a problem with that.
They're not
right?
happy about that. Yeah.
And why is that?
Because they're in session, and they think that's a disadvantage, not being able to campaign in the lead up while they're in session doing their job. In most cases, their second job, right? Their night job.
Maybe that would hasten the departure.
I think
what do you think?
That's an
Let's get out
benefit.
earlier.
Yeah, that's an ancillary benefit.
In election years only.
Right. I think June is the perfect time because you're going to have the most engagement, right? And you're right. That's what we're all about. We want voter engagement. But beyond that, we want to make sure we're not disenfranchising our military personnel or the folks who live overseas. So we're trying to find a happy medium here that will allow us to do our job well in case there is a litigated election or a really close election. But I think for democracy's sake, we should be doing it earlier, for sure.
So in a perfect world, May or June, but don't let perfect be the enemy of the good.
Correct.
Do you think that bill's going to go through this year? Do you have?
I think some version of that bill is going to come through. Will we for certain get the last Tuesday in August? I'm not sure, but I think we're working toward getting something that's at least a little earlier. And that, again, the negotiations are still going on. The committees are still discussing the options, but I think we have sounded the warning that this is not if, this is when. This is going to happen, and if we're stuck in a position where the Department of Justice sanctions us, where we're exposed as not getting ballots to our military personnel on time, that's just a bad look for everybody. So I know the General Assembly understands it, and we're working toward a solution.
A lot of people in Rhode Island hesitate from voting in primaries because most of us are now unaffiliated. That's the mass majority of people, right? Registered in Rhode Island.
45%.
So when you go in, you have to declare Democrat or Republican, and you have to fill out the little thing when you go. You want to change that.
Yeah, as somebody who's knocked on a lot of doors, I know that Rhode Islanders are leery about that. They don't want to be connected to one party or the other.
Even for that little bit of time when they're...
For whatever reason, there are a multitude of reasons why you may not want to be connected, and some of it's based on party solicitation. But I've had people who say, I'd love to vote for you, but I don't vote in primaries because I don't want to affiliate. So Senator Raptakis and Representative Serpa have both presented bills that would create a situation where if you're unaffiliated and you go vote in either the Democratic or Republican primary, you'll leave unaffiliated. There is no process to disaffiliate. And we think that will take some of that leeriness out of the process. And we've heard from many people who say, I forgot. And I showed up to vote in the next primary and I couldn't because I forgot to disaffiliate. And that's not a good reason to deny somebody access to a primary. So we know that our primary participation rates are low, and they're low across the country, but they're low. So we want to address that, and we also want to make people feel comfortable going into the ballot box. And this is a really good starting point to do that. And I sponsored this bill for years. Senator Raptakis has sponsored it for as long as he's been here. And we believe this year is the year it's going to move.
Is that because you're sitting in this office now and not in the chamber?
I don't know. I
mean, what gives you optimism?
I think there was a perception that if you didn't identify the voter by party, the voter information would not get to candidates or potential candidates in regard to how they would go about their election process.
And that's a key part in their campaigning and finding out
It is.
Right.
And we have kind of eased those concerns in that you'll still be able to identify who voted in a Republican or a Democratic primary, but you won't be affiliated. And I think most candidates understand the technology has moved to the point where you can run those reports, they're accurate, we know exactly who voted in which primary, that's public record.
The 20-day early voting, we've had that for a couple of cycles now. Some people think that's too long. You think that's about right?
I don't know yet. What I do know is that we should test it out during the 24 presidential election.
The first true non-pandemic.
Correct. Because we really can't look at good data until we have a presidential and see how many people come out and vote in the first 5 days, the next 5 days. And the best part about early voting is that on election day, there are virtually no lines. And for most Rhode Islanders who are voting on election day, that's very appealing. And for our elections workers, and I'll be honest, some of our elections workers are the people saying that 20 days are too long. There's a cost associated with that. There's time that's associated with that. In some places, there's nobody showing up in those first couple of days. But the burden that's taken off of them on election day, especially presidential election day, is significant. And so I would like to see it play out and then regroup, take a look at the data, and determine whether or not that can be adjusted. I think any adjustment to that should include a weekend. And so I think that might be the happy medium if we are going to adjust that.
10 days with a weekend.
Correct. But I think we need to really look at what 24 looks like.
From people I've talked to in my own voting, what I found is, people say, oh, what about the October or the November surprise? My answer to that is, well, buyer beware. I mean, if you're going to go and vote, but that most people are doing out of convenience. So we went Thursday or Friday before the election. It was a 5-day window. I wasn't voting 15 days before. Do you have data yet that says X percentage of people 5 days, 10 days, 15?
We do.
And when was it all closer to the election?
I know in the first 5 days, it was around 30% of the voters, the early voters. I don't know what the breakdown is after that because I'm looking at the data in relationship to this conversation. Is it been too long? Is it too long a window? So I do know that around 30% vote in those first 5 days. So obviously 70 broken down between the next two gaps. But again, we don't know what that looks like in a presidential.
Right. You talked about election workers. What about poll workers? We have an aging workforce at the polls. And I noticed, I did a story, I can't remember, maybe it was the pandemic year. They were desperate for people because at that point, a lot of elderly people didn't want to be in contact with the public. What are you doing about that? I know that's not your job, but that's also the elections board.
It's the Board of Elections, but we've made it our job as part of our civic education outreach. So we go into schools. I was at a school today. I do a civics lesson on voting rights, and then we talk about an opportunity for students, high school students, to come in and work at the polls. And there's a lot of benefits to having a high school student that's interested in doing that. The technology does not bother them, the poll books. In fact, they can help some of their older colleagues with that. But it also gets them involved in the election process. And we know, and I know personally in East Providence, my former students used to work the polls and were considered to be fantastic poll workers. Anybody that's interested in this is interested, so they'll do a good job. So we're recruiting through our school visits. We've also talked with the Superintendent's Association, the Commissioner of Education. We've talked to the Post-Secondary Commissioner, Commissioner Gilkey, and we're trying to work toward a dual purpose of not only getting paid for that day, and the pay is not enough, it should be more, but also receiving either credit on the higher education level or community service hours for a high school student. Because right now there are many districts that don't offer community service hours because you're paid for that day. But we're kind of selling this as it is, as kind of a patriotic thing to do, something to help democracy flourish and making sure we get the next generation of poll workers. So it's on our radar. We're also asking businesses, and anytime I talk to a business group, and as you know, we have a large business services division, I ask them, will you be willing to offer a paid day for your worker to go and work at their local poll, because it will help preserve democracy. And there's a ripple effect in regard to explaining how the system works. Someone that's there from 7 to 7 can talk to folks about how secure the system is, how the data is accurate, how secure the machines are, who comes in and fixes the machines and when, that there are poll watchers. I mean, I think that's really valuable in the current environment.
You clearly were not in office in the last election, but did you get a sense from in kind of talking with your predecessor and maybe other people that there really does need to be a refilling of the ranks? Were they scrambling, or had it come back from the pandemic in terms of people actually there on election day?
I think they get it done, right? But they get it done just barely.
It's a long day,
and
isn't it?
And that's the challenge. I mean, like I said, there's a monetary challenge, and we should be paying folks more than what we're paying them, which I think is in the range of $250. It should be more than that. And the other thing that I think has had an impact, I know it's had an impact, are national headlines and national stories. I mean, there are poll workers that have been threatened across the country, physically threatened across the country. And even though that has not happened here in Rhode Island, if you're watching the nightly news or you're reading your morning paper and you're reading about a poll worker being threatened, their families being threatened, you're going to think twice about doing that job, which you may not have thought twice about until you read that headline.
Finally, there's periodic stories about voter rolls and cleaning up the voter rolls, and that's obviously a key part of your office. What I think a lot of people don't realize is you don't want to disenfranchise, so you're not going to be bouncing people, off. But talk about that and where you are. I know the latest data. Do you get rolling data on that?
Yeah, sure.
So talk
Daily
about
data.
what you've done since you took office in January.
So it's good to point out that the Let Rhode Island Vote Act, which expanded access, right, through mail ballots, through drop boxes, a whole host of things that made voting easier, also included a provision that requires the Department of State to do voter list maintenance based on the national change of address reports from the U.S. Postal Service 4 times a year. Now that's complementary to the data we update every single day from the DMV, data we get every month from the Department of Corrections, data we get every 2 weeks from the Department of Health on those that have passed away, and then our membership in ERIC, the Electronic Registration Information Center, which is 27 to 30 states. We still have information from some of those states who have left ERIC. But basically that's states sharing with each other in-state moves, out-of-state moves, death records, Social Security records, so that we can kind of cross-check between the states. So there's a robust effort to make sure we maintain voter rolls, which is not purging voters. So I think about a month into my tenure, we did a press release in regard to removing 60,000 plus folks from our voter list. And that's a direct result of the pandemic election cycle, where every registered voter was sent a mail ballot application. If those were returned undeliverable, then those voters were put on an inactive list. If they didn't, and this is law, if they didn't vote in the next 2 federal elections, they were removed from that list. And so that's why 60,000 folks were removed from the list. They're not living here anymore. But I would encourage people to go and check their voter registration, which they can do on our website, sos.ri.gov, and they can adjust their own voter registration as long as they know their birth date. They can adjust that. And I think that's the best way to make sure your voting records are up to date is check them yourselves.
And so ERIC flags the triggers. So let's say you're a Rhode Islander and you get a license in New York.
Correct.
Right? Are they part of the?
It's DMV information. It's
so
Social
that
Security
cancels out your
Correct.
registration. What if you're in North Carolina?
What it does is it clues us into a duplicate, and then we investigate the process.
But it's on you to cancel here in Rhode Island.
Correct.
If somebody, so they may get a license and not necessarily be registered in New York.
Right, but
know they're not. But then you have to do the deeper dive?
Yeah, but if the same person shows up on both voter lists, we know that based on the DMV data or other data from that state, we can remove them from our list.
Does a license give you license, pun fully intended, to cancel them out, or do they have to be on the voter rolls down there?
No,
in order not to be considered a Rhode Islander.
They'd still be placed inactive based on federal law. So they'd still be inactive, but if you're inactive, you've got to go through a process to make sure that you can vote, and that includes an identification that proves that you're living in that place.